He brought his girlfriend to our 15th anniversary dinner and introduced her as his future wife. What he didn't know was that by next week, his century-old family business would belong to his biggest competitor. Let me tell you how I orchestrated the perfect corporate takedown. The private dining room at La Maison Dorée felt suffocating that evening, despite its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers. I'd spent weeks planning this anniversary dinner, selecting the perfect vintage of Chateau Lafite, Phil's favorite, and ensuring every detail was immaculate. 15 years of marriage deserved nothing less. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What I didn't expect was for my husband to turn our milestone celebration into a stage for his grand betrayal. I watched as Phil confidently strode through the restaurant's ornate doors, his hand possessively placed on the small of his companion's back. Scarlett, his 28-year-old marketing director, wore a designer dress that I recognized from the company's recent Fashion Week expenditure reports. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was flaunting his affair using company money, the same company his great-grandfather had built from nothing. "Jean, darling." Phil's voice carried that familiar patronizing tone he'd perfected in corporate boardrooms. "I thought it was time we had an honest conversation about the future." He pulled out Scarlett's chair, my chair, at our traditional anniversary table. The same table where we'd celebrated every year since taking over Powell Industries. From his father. The sommelier approached with the wine I'd pre-ordered, a 1982 Chateau Lafite that Phil had always reserved for special occasions. He reached for the bottle with practiced elegance, as if this were just another business dinner where he was courting potential investors. But tonight was different. Tonight, every gesture, every word, every calculated move would become evidence. In the corporate endgame I'd been orchestrating for months. "I assume you've noticed things haven't been optimal between us lately," Phil continued, his corporate jargon seeping into what should have been a personal moment. Scarlett shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her perfectly manicured fingers playing with the Cartier bracelet on her wrist. A gift from the company's discretionary fund, I knew, having seen the receipt in last month's expenses. I maintained my composure, years of sitting through high-stakes business negotiations finally, proving useful in my personal life. "Optimal?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. "Is that how we're describing our marriage now, in terms of business metrics?" Phil's smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did anymore. "Jean, let's be practical. We've both known this was coming. Scarlett represents the future of both my personal life and Powell Industries. The board agrees we need younger, more dynamic leadership to take the company forward." What Phil didn't realize, as he sat there playing with his wine glass and rehearsing his carefully prepared speech, was that I'd spent the last 6 months preparing for this moment. Every late night he thought I was grieving our failing marriage. I was actually meeting with Nicholas Wright, CEO of Wright Enterprises, Powell Industries' biggest competitor, and the company that had been trying to acquire us for the past decade. I took a slow sip of wine, savoring both its rich bouquet and the knowledge of what was to come. "The future of Powell Industries," I mused, watching Scarlett's face carefully. "That's an interesting choice of words, Phil." The pieces were already in motion. The board meeting scheduled for Monday morning wouldn't just be announcing Phil's plan to divorce me. It would reveal the carefully orchestrated transfer of controlling interest to Wright Enterprises. A transfer that Phil's own arrogance had made possible when he'd insisted I take a position on the board to keep myself occupied after our last major argument. "I've had my lawyers draw up generous divorce terms," Phil continued, reaching into his briefcase. "Given our history, I think you'll find them more than fair." I allowed myself a small smile. In less than 72 hours, there wouldn't be anything left for him to be generous with. The company's intellectual property, client, contracts, and market position would all belong to Nicholas Wright. The grandson of the man Phil's great-grandfather had once muscled out of the industry would finally have his revenge, served on a silver platter by the scorned wife his competitor had underestimated. "You know, Phil," I said, reaching for my own briefcase, "I also have some papers I think you should see." The weight of the documents inside felt satisfying. Board meeting minutes, voting proxy agreements, and the final piece. Proof of Phil's systematic misuse of company resources to fund his affair with Scarlett. The night was young, and this perfectly planned anniversary dinner was about to become the beginning of something neither Phil nor his young protege could have anticipated. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just about getting even, it's about taking everything. I gave the subtle signal to the maitre d' we had arranged earlier. Right on schedule, Nicholas Wright himself would be arriving in exactly 30 minutes. After all, what better way to celebrate the end of a marriage than by toasting to new business partnerships? Phil was about to learn that in both love and business, underestimating your partner is the costliest mistake you can make. The maitre d' approached our table with practiced grace, carrying a sealed envelope that would set the next phase of my plan in motion. Phil barely noticed, too engrossed in outlining his vision of Powell Industries' future with Scarlett by his side. The restaurant's ambient lighting caught the diamond necklace at her throat, another corporate expense I'd carefully documented over the past months. "The wine selection this evening," Phil announced with his characteristic pomposity, "reminds me of that merger celebration in Tuscany last spring." He either didn't notice or chose to ignore how Scarlett's perfectly composed expression flickered at the mention of that particular trip. Of course it would. That was the weekend they'd thought they were being so discreet, not realizing that their separate business trips to the same Italian vineyard had been logged in the company's travel expenses. La Maison Doré's private dining room had always been our special place. The hand-painted ceiling murals, the antique brass fixtures, and the wall of windows overlooking the city skyline had witnessed a decade and a half of our anniversary celebrations. Now, these same elegant surroundings would bear witness to something entirely different. "You mentioned the board's support," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. The vintage's deep, ruby color caught the light, reminiscent of the blood Phil was about to watch drain from his corporate empire. How interesting that must have been to secure, given the voting regulations in the company charter. Phil's expression shifted slightly, the same micro-expression I'd seen countless times when he thought he had the upper hand in negotiations. "The board understands the need for progressive leadership," he replied smoothly. "Scarlett's vision for digital transformation aligns perfectly with where we need to take Powell Industries." I allowed myself a small smile, remembering the late-night conversations with Nicholas Wright over the past 6 months. The irony was delicious. While Phil had been grooming his young protege to help him seize greater control of the company, I'd been methodically preparing to hand it to his greatest rival. "Digital transformation?" I echoed, watching Scarlett preen at the praise. "Is that what we're calling the systematic reallocation of company resources these days?" The maitre d' chose that moment to return, this time with a vintage I hadn't ordered. "Compliments of Mr. Wright," he announced, presenting the bottle with a flourish. The look of confusion on Phil's face was priceless. Nicholas Wright. Phil's voice carried a note of uncertainty I'd rarely heard before. "He's here?" "Oh, did I forget to mention?" I took another slow sip of wine. "I invited him to join us. I thought it appropriate, given the circumstances. He should be arriving any minute now." The color drained from Scarlett's face. As the company's marketing director, she was well aware of the decades-long rivalry between Powell Industries and Wright Enterprises. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was how I'd spent the last 6 months cultivating a relationship with Nicholas that went far beyond mere corporate rivalry. "Jean." Phil's voice had taken on that warning tone he used when he thought I was overstepping. "This is hardly the time or place for business discussions. We're here to discuss our personal matters." I smiled, remembering all the board meetings, where he'd dismissed my input, all the company galas where he'd introduced me as the wife, rather than acknowledging my role as a board member. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But darling, I replied, isn't that exactly what you're doing? Mixing business with pleasure? The private dining room suddenly felt smaller as Nicholas Wright's commanding presence filled the doorway. At 60, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from building rather than inheriting success. His silver hair and impeccable suit spoke of old money, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes revealed why he'd managed to keep Wright Enterprises competitive against Powell Industries all these years. Phil, Nicholas nodded cordially, pulling up a chair to our table as if he'd been invited to a friendly dinner rather than walking into the lion's den. Scarlett, Jean, you look lovely as always. The look of barely contained fury on Phil's face was something I'd remember for years to come. He'd spent his entire career trying to outmaneuver Nicholas Wright, never suspecting that his own wife would be the one to finally give Wright the opening he needed. "What is this?" Phil demanded, his corporate mask slipping to reveal the anger beneath. "This," I said, opening my briefcase, "is what happens when you underestimate the power of a woman scorned, particularly one you've given a seat on your board of directors." The stage was set, the players were in position, and as I prepared to reveal the first piece of evidence that would begin Phil's downfall, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetry of the moment. He'd brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner, thinking to humiliate me. Instead, he'd walked right into an elaborate trap that would cost him everything his family had spent generations building. Nicholas raised his glass in a subtle toast, his eyes twinkling with appreciation for the drama unfolding before him. After all, he'd helped orchestrate every detail of what was about to happen. The next few hours would change the landscape of both our personal and professional lives forever, and not even Phil's army of corporate lawyers would be able to stop. Let the game begin. "I believe we should discuss the recent audit findings," I said, withdrawing a thick folder from my briefcase. Phil's eyes narrowed at the Powell Industries logo embossed on its cover. It was the same folder he'd casually dismissed when I'd tried to bring up concerning expenditures at last month's board meeting. "Jean." Phil's voice carried that patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of mansplaining in corporate meetings. "This isn't the time or place for what, Phil? For discussing how company funds have been systematically misappropriated for personal expenses." I laid out the first document, a detailed expense report highlighting certain interesting patterns. Like this five-star hotel in Tuscany, booked twice for the same weekend under separate corporate accounts. Scarlett's perfect composure cracked. Slightly. She reached for her water glass, her hand trembling just enough to make the ice cubes clink. Nicholas Wright leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed attention, as if he were watching a particularly engaging business presentation. "Those were legitimate business expenses," Phil snapped, his fingers drumming against the fine linen tablecloth. The board approved standard travel expenses," I interrupted smoothly. "They didn't approve matching his and hers spa treatments, or the private villa with the infinity pool, or the vintage champagne delivered to room 512. A room booked under the company's marketing budget, isn't that right, Scarlett?" The young woman's face had lost its rosy glow. She looked uncertainly at Phil, who was now glaring at the documents as if he could make them disappear through sheer force of will. "You've been going through confidential company records," he accused, trying to regain control of the situation. "That's a breach of—" "Board members have full access to all financial records," Nicholas interjected mildly. "It's in the company charter your great-grandfather wrote. Article 7, Section 3, if I'm not mistaken." He smiled, taking an appreciative sip of his wine. "Excellent vintage, by the way. A shame to waste it on such uncomfortable conversations." Withdrew another document from the folder. "Speaking of uncomfortable conversations, let's discuss the recent restructuring of the marketing department." Particularly interesting how several experienced employees were let go to make room for new hires, all personally selected by our young marketing director here. Scarlett straightened in her chair, attempting to project professional confidence. Those personnel changes were necessary for the department's modernization strategy. Modernization strategy, I repeated thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling it when qualified professionals are replaced by your former sorority sisters, all of whom, coincidentally, received salaries well above industry standard? Phil's face had taken on a dangerous red tinge. You're overstepping, Jean. The board will be very interested in reviewing these findings. I cut in, laying out more documents, especially the part about how company funds were used to purchase luxury items, like this Cartier bracelet, logged as client appreciation gifts, but currently adorning your companion's wrist. Scarlett instinctively covered the bracelet with her other hand, her eyes darting between Phil and the damning paper trail I was creating on the table. You've certainly been thorough, Nicholas commented, examining one of the reports with professional interest. Impressive attention to detail. Reminds me of how my father used to audit his managers. Trust, but verify. Phil's jaw clenched at the mention of the Wright family. If you think you can use some creative accounting to... Creative accounting? I laughed softly. Oh, no, darling. Everything here is documented with perfect accuracy. Every expense, every authorization, every signature, including yours on these forms authorizing business development trips that coincidentally matched Scarlett's personal vacation posts on Instagram. I slid my phone across the table, showing a carousel of Scarlett's social media posts, pristine beaches, intimate candlelit dinners, luxury hotel suites. Each image was paired with a corresponding company expense report. You've been stalking my social media? Scarlett's voice cracked slightly. Stalking implies secrecy, I corrected. Your posts are public, something a marketing director should probably know about privacy settings, though I suppose actual marketing expertise wasn't the primary qualification for your position. Phil slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. Enough. Whatever you think you're doing here. What I'm doing, I said calmly, is demonstrating a pattern of corporate misconduct that the board won't be able to ignore, especially not with Powell Industries' biggest competitor as a witness. I nodded, toward Nicholas, who raised his glass in acknowledgement. You brought Wright into this? Phil's voice was deadly quiet now. Do you have any idea what you've done? Created a hostile takeover opportunity? Nicholas suggested helpfully. Though hostile might not be the right word, given how cooperative your wife has been. The realization finally dawned in Phil's eyes. He looked at me with a mixture of fury and dawning comprehension. You've been working with Wright Enterprises? Let's just say Nicholas and I share an interest in proper corporate governance, I replied. And in seeing Powell Industries return to the ethical standards your great-grandfather established. By selling out to our biggest rival? Phil's voice rose incredulously. The same rival my family has fought for 3 generations? No, Phil, I corrected him. By ensuring the company's legacy isn't destroyed by your inability to keep your personal and professional lives separate. The board meeting on Monday should be particularly interesting. Scarlett pushed her chair back slightly, as if physically distancing herself from the impending disaster. Phil, maybe we should... Stay right there, he commanded, his mask of civilized control cracking further. This is nothing but a desperate attempt to... To what? I asked softly. To hold you accountable? To protect the company's reputation? To ensure that a century of business excellence isn't sacrificed for your midlife crisis? The maitre d' approached again, this time carrying a laptop. As requested, madame, he said, setting it up at the end of the table. The screen flickered to life, showing a video conference window with familiar faces, the other members of Powell Industries' board of directors. I hope you don't mind, I said to Phil's increasingly pale face. But I thought the board might want to join us for this discussion. After all, transparency is one of our core corporate values, isn't it? I excused myself from the table with practiced elegance, leaving Phil to face the board members whose pixelated faces now filled the laptop screen. The ladies' room at La Maison Dorée was exactly as I remembered it, all golden fixtures and hand-painted silk wallpaper. A fitting place to pause and savor the beginning of Phil's downfall. In the ornate mirror, I studied my reflection. The black Chanel dress I'd chosen for tonight, purchased with my own money, not company funds, suddenly felt like armor. Not a hair out of place, not a smudge in my carefully applied makeup. The woman staring back at me looked composed, controlled, and utterly dangerous. Tonight wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about reclaiming power that had been slowly stripped away over 15 years. I took out my phone, checking the series of texts that had been quietly arriving. Throughout dinner, everything was proceeding according to schedule. Legal team standing by. From Nicholas's corporate counsel, board members all logged in. From his executive assistant, financial documents prepared for distribution. From the forensic accounting team. My hands were steady as I reapplied my lipstick, the same shade I'd worn to my first board meeting, when Phil had patronizingly suggested I just sit and observe. If only he'd known then that every dismissive comment, every condescending gesture was being filed away for future reference. The bathroom door opened, and Scarlett slipped in, her confident facade crumbling around the edges. She started when she saw me at the mirror, clearly having thought she'd find refuge in an empty powder room. Feeling overwhelmed? I asked mildly, watching her reflection. It's understandable. Corporate takeovers can be so stressful, especially for those caught in the crossfire. I never meant, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. The young woman who'd so confidently taken my seat at the anniversary dinner now looked very much her age. Never meant what? I turned to face her directly. Never meant to sleep with a married man? Never meant to help him misappropriate company funds? Never meant to get caught? You'll have to be more specific. She gripped the marble countertop, her knuckles white. Phil said everything was above board. The expenses, the promotions, all of it. He said, as CEO, he has a fiduciary duty to the company and its shareholders, I completed for her. A duty he's been negligent in fulfilling, as the board is now discovering. Tell me, did he promise to make you the youngest chief marketing officer in company history? The flash of recognition in her eyes confirmed my suspicion. That position was supposed to be announced next month, she whispered. I smiled, remembering a similar promise made to me years ago. Phil has a habit of making promises with things that don't belong to him. The company, its resources, its future, none of it was ever truly his to give away. My phone buzzed again. Another update from Nicholas's team. The preliminary board vote was proceeding exactly as we'd anticipated. Phil's carefully constructed world was unraveling thread by thread in the dining room, while his young protégé stood trembling in the ladies' room, facing the consequences of her choices. What's going to happen now? Scarlett asked, her voice small. I checked my watch. An elegant Patek Philippe that Phil had given me for our 10th anniversary. In about 20 minutes, the board will call for an emergency session to address the evidence of financial misconduct. By tomorrow morning, trading of Powell Industries stock will be temporarily suspended. By next week, the company will have new ownership and leadership. I met her eyes in the mirror. As for you, well, that depends on how cooperative you're willing to be. Cooperative? Nicholas Wright is an excellent businessman, I explained, touching up my powder. He understands the value of young talent when properly managed and ethically guided. Your actual marketing skills, separate from your relationship with Phil, could be an asset to Wright Enterprises. Assuming, of course, you're willing to provide a full statement about Phil's misuse of company resources. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You're offering me a way out. I'm offering you a choice, I corrected. More than Phil ever did. He saw you as an accessory to his midlife crisis, a way to feel powerful and young again. I'm seeing you as what you could have been if he hadn't corrupted your potential for his own ego." My phone buzzed once more, Nicholas requesting my return to the dining room. The board had reached their preliminary decision, right on schedule. "Take a moment to fix your makeup," I advised Scarlett, moving toward the door. "Then think carefully about where your loyalty lies, with a man who's about to lose everything, or with your own future." The weight of my grandmother's locket felt heavy against my chest, the same locket I'd worn when I first met Phil at that corporate law conference 16 years ago. Inside was a small photo from our wedding day, a reminder of what we'd once been and what he'd thrown away for the illusion of youth and power. As I walked back toward the dining room, my heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor, I thought about the long game I'd been playing. 6 months of careful planning, of quiet meetings with Nicholas Wright, of documenting every indiscretion and financial irregularity. Phil had always underestimated me, had never bothered to look beyond the surface of the corporate wife role he'd assigned me. His mistake had been forgetting my background in corporate law, forgetting that I'd once specialized in hostile takeovers before he'd convinced me to step back from my career for the sake of our marriage. Now those same skills would be his undoing. I paused outside the private dining room, hearing Phil's raised voice through the heavy door. He was undoubtedly trying to regain control of the situation, to charm or bully his way out of the trap I'd set. But it was too late. The machinery I'd set in motion was far beyond his ability to stop. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to return to the table. The next phase of my plan was about to begin, and I wanted to savor every moment of Phil's realization that he'd not only lost his marriage, but the dynasty his family had spent generations building. Sometimes the perfect revenge requires patience, precision, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. Phil was about to learn that he wasn't the only one who knew how to play corporate chess. As I returned to the private dining room, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Phil was standing now, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he attempted to address the board members on the video conference screen. "This is nothing but a misunderstanding," he was saying, his voice carrying that false confidence I'd heard so many times in difficult board meetings. "These expenses were all properly authorized by you," I interrupted smoothly, retaking my seat. "Which becomes problematic when those authorizations show a clear pattern of personal benefit." I withdrew another set of documents from my briefcase. "Speaking of patterns, shall we discuss the recent changes to the company's procurement policies?" Nicholas. Wright leaned forward with interest, while Phil's face darkened. The procurement changes had been his pet project, pushed through during a board meeting I was supposedly unable to attend due to a family emergency, an emergency he had fabricated. "The procurement restructuring was necessary for operational efficiency," Phil stated flatly, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He knew exactly what I'd found. "Operational efficiency," I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what we're calling it when all major contracts are mysteriously redirected through companies owned by Scarlett's family members?" Through the laptop screen, I could see several board members exchanging alarmed glances. Phil's hand tightened on his wine glass. "The Porter family has a long history in supply chain management," he began, but I cut him off. "The Porter family didn't exist in supply chain management until 6 months ago," I corrected, laying out registration documents for several newly formed companies. "Interesting timing, considering that's when Scarlett's brother suddenly decided to leave his career as a fitness instructor to become a procurement specialist." Scarlett, who had quietly returned to the table, looked as though she might be sick. Her brother's involvement had clearly been meant to remain hidden. "Those contracts were awarded based on merit," Phil insisted, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Merit?" I raised an eyebrow, sliding another document across the table. "Like this contract for office furniture that's priced at 3 times the market rate? Or perhaps we should discuss the consulting fees being paid to a company registered under your girlfriend's mother's maiden name?" The board members on the screen were now leaning forward, their expressions a mixture of shock and growing anger. Phil had always counted on their disengagement, their tendency to rubber stamp his decisions. He hadn't counted on someone actually reading the fine print. "You've been investigating me?" he demanded, anger finally overtaking his professional mask. "No, darling," I smiled. "I've been doing my job as a board member. The same job you insisted I take because— what was it you said? It'll give you something to occupy your time while I handle the real business." Nicholas Wright chose this moment to add his perspective. The board might also be interested in how these inflated contracts have affected Powell Industries' market competitiveness. "My analysis suggests the company has been operating at a significant disadvantage due to these unusual procurement arrangements." Phil's head snapped toward him. "You have no right to access our—" "Actually," I interrupted, "I provided Mr. Wright with all this information. As a board member, it's my duty to investigate any situations that might harm the company's interests. Having our biggest competitor verify my findings seemed prudent." I gestured to the maitre d', who approached with another envelope. "Which brings us to the most interesting discovery." I withdrew a single document, the smoking gun I'd been saving for this exact moment. "Would you like to explain why Powell Industries has been paying rent on a luxury penthouse that doesn't appear in any official company records?" The color drained from Phil's face. The penthouse had been his secret, a love nest paid for with company funds but hidden through a complex series of internal accounts. "That's confidential, company," he began, but one of the board members on screen cut him off. "Mr. Powell, are you saying you were aware of this property?" The question came from Tobias Hartford, the board's most senior member and a close friend of Phil's father. Phil's silence was damning. I continued, my voice carrying clearly to the video conference. "The penthouse lease, registered under a variation of Scarlett's middle name, has been paid for using funds allocated to executive retention programs. A rather ironic choice of classification, wouldn't you say?" Through the screen, I could see Tobias removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture I'd seen many times when he was particularly disappointed. "Phil, please tell me this isn't what it appears to be." But Phil couldn't tell him that, because it was exactly what it appeared to be. A systematic misuse of company resources to fund his affair, all while believing his position as CEO made him untouchable. "I think," Nicholas said into the heavy silence, "this might be a good time to discuss the offer Wright Enterprises has prepared for the board's consideration." And there it was, the moment when Phil finally understood the true extent of what was happening. This wasn't just about exposing his indiscretions or his financial misconduct. This was about taking everything. The look he gave me was one I'd remember forever, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and dawning comprehension that he had severely underestimated the woman he'd dismissed as nothing more than a corporate wife. Perfect revenge isn't just about exposing secrets. It's about using those secrets to dismantle an empire, piece by carefully documented piece. "Before the board reviews Wright Enterprises' offer," I said, reaching for a final set of documents, "I think we should discuss how we arrived at this moment. After all, context is everything." Phil's face had taken on the ashen quality I'd seen only once before, the day his father had suffered a heart attack in the middle of a board meeting. That day had changed everything, shifting power dynamics that had held steady for decades. "Do you remember that day, Phil?" I asked, laying out a photograph from his father's last board meeting. "The day you convinced the board that your father's temporary absence required an immediate transfer of voting control." Several board members on the screen shifted uncomfortably. That hastily called emergency session had been the beginning of Phil's transformation from dutiful son to ruthless CEO. "My father's health required immediate action," Phil snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "The company needed stable leadership." "Stable leadership," I echoed. Like how you stabilized the situation by having your father transferred to a private care facility 2 states away? The same facility that mysteriously restricted all visitors except immediate family? Nicholas Wright leaned back, watching the drama unfold with keen interest. He, better than anyone, understood the weight of family legacy in corporate politics. You isolated your own father, I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the private dining room. Kept him away from board members who might question your decisions, all while systematically dismantling the ethical framework he'd spent decades building. Scarlett looked between Phil and me, clearly realizing she was witnessing the unraveling of a story much deeper than a simple marital betrayal. That's ancient history, Phil attempted to dismiss, but Tobias Hartford's voice cut through the video feed. Is it, Phil? Because I've been trying to visit Kevin Powell for months. Your secretary always has some excuse about his treatment schedule. Or doctor's orders. I withdrew another document from my folder. Perhaps this might interest you, Tobias. Medical reports from Kevin's care facility, showing he's been deemed fully competent to make business decisions for the past 18 months. Phil's hand jerked, knocking over his wine glass. The red liquid spread across the white tablecloth, like blood, a fitting metaphor for the evening's revelations. Those are corporate medical insurance records, I corrected, accessible to any board member reviewing executive benefits. You really should have read the company bylaws more carefully, darling. I turned to address the board members directly through the screen. Kevin Powell built this company on principles of integrity and family values. He taught these values to his son, just as his father had taught them to him. But somewhere along the way, Phil decided those principles were outdated, that they were holding the company back from modernization. My father's management style was becoming obsolete, Phil interjected desperately. The market was changing, I acknowledged. But your father's ethical standards weren't obsolete. They were inconvenient. Inconvenient for your plans to restructure the company. Inconvenient for your desire to use corporate resources as your personal piggy bank. Inconvenient for your affair with a subordinate half. Your age. I laid out another photograph, this one from our wedding day. Phil and his father stood side by side, both beaming with pride. Kevin Powell welcomed me into the family that day. He spent hours telling me stories about the company's history, about the principles it was built on. He made me promise to help, protect his son from the corrupting influence of power. A promise you've clearly broken, Phil snarled, but I could see the fear behind his anger. No, Phil. I'm keeping that promise today. Your father knew the temptations that came with corporate power. He tried to protect you from them, to guide you. But you chose a different path. I gestured to Nicholas Wright. Do you know why I chose to work with Wright Enterprises specifically? Because your father and Nicholas's father were actually close friends before your grandfather's aggressive takeover attempts drove them apart. Another piece of family history you never bothered to learn, Nicholas nodded solemnly. My father always said Kevin Powell was the only honorable member of your family. He regretted how corporate ambitions destroyed their friendship. The revelation seemed to stun Phil, momentarily silent. I used the opportunity to drive home the final point. Everything that's happening tonight, the exposure of your misconduct, the evidence of your mismanagement, the potential sale to Wright Enterprises, it's all because you forgot the fundamental lessons your father tried to teach you about integrity, about responsibility, about the true meaning of legacy. I could see the board members on screen nodding, particularly the older ones who remembered Kevin Powell's leadership style. Your father isn't just alive and well, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of 15 years of accumulated knowledge. He's been watching everything you've done to his company, every ethical compromise, every misuse of funds, every betrayal of trust. I've made sure he's received detailed reports of everything. Phil's face went from ashen to scarlet. You've been reporting to my father? Someone had to keep him informed about what was happening to his life's work. And now, thanks to those medical reports clearing him for business activities, he'll have a vote at Monday's board meeting. The silence that followed was deafening. Phil stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as his wife, not as a board member, but as the architect of his downfall. I had played the long game, building relationships, gathering evidence, and waiting for the perfect moment to reveal how thoroughly he had betrayed not just me, but the entire Powell legacy. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't just about exposing current misdeeds. It's about revealing how those misdeeds are part of a larger pattern of betrayal that stretches back years. The stage was set for the next phase of revelations, and Phil was about to learn just how much damage could be done by underestimating a woman who had spent 15 years learning every detail of his family's business. The atmosphere in the private dining room crackled with tension as I withdrew a final set of documents from my briefcase. These weren't copies. They were the originals, printed on Powell Industries letterhead, bearing signatures that would change everything. There's something poetic, I began, carefully arranging the papers on the table, about how history tends to repeat itself. Your grandfather tried to force out Nicholas's family through aggressive takeover tactics, and now here we are, but with quite a different outcome approaching. Phil's eyes were fixed on the documents, recognizing the distinctive watermark of the company's most confidential paperwork. Where did you get those? From your father's private safe, I replied calmly. The one behind the Monet in his study. The study you converted into your personal cigar room the week after you sent him to the care facility. Through the video conference screen, the board members leaned forward, their interest piqued by the mention of Kevin Powell's private documents. Phil's hand twitched toward the papers, but Nicholas smoothly slid them out of reach. Fascinating reading, Nicholas commented, examining the first page. Particularly the sections about contingency, succession planning. Kevin was quite thorough in outlining the conditions under which control of the company could be redistributed. Those documents are outdated, Phil snapped, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The board approved my assumption of control. Under false pretenses, I interrupted, nodding to the maitre d' who approached with yet another laptop. Perhaps we should hear from someone else about that board meeting. The screen flickered to life, revealing a face that made Phil physically recoil. His father, Kevin Powell, looking considerably healthier and more alert than the image of the incapacitated man Phil had presented to the board 18 months ago. Hello, son. Kevin's voice was strong and clear. I believe we're overdue for a conversation about the future of Powell Industries. Scarlett, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood. I should go. Sit down, Miss Porter, Kevin commanded, his tone brooking no argument. You're as much a part of this story as anyone else. His eyes, sharp despite his years, fixed on the young woman who had helped his son dismantle decades of corporate ethics. Dad, Phil started, but Kevin cut him off. I've been receiving weekly reports about your activities for the past year, Kevin continued, his disappointment evident. At first, I couldn't believe what I was reading. My own son, using the company I built as his personal playground. Making a mockery of everything I tried to teach you about business ethics and family responsibility. The board members on the other screen watched in rapt attention as the former CEO addressed his son. Phil seemed to shrink in his chair, the weight of his father's words crushing his carefully constructed facade. Jean has kept me informed of everything, Kevin continued. Every misappropriated fund, every questionable contract, every ethical breach, including your relationship with the young lady you hired to replace seasoned executives. Scarlett flinched at the reference, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The documents in front of you, Kevin gestured to the papers Nicholas held, outline very specific conditions for emergency transfer of control. Conditions that become active in cases of gross misconduct or breach of fiduciary duty by the current CEO. Phil's face had gone from red to white. You can't. I can, and I will. Kevin's voice was firm. As the original controlling shareholder, I retained certain rights. Rights you would have known about if you'd spent more time learning about corporate governance and less time abusing your position. I reached across the table and retrieved another document, the coup de grace. This, I said, sliding it in front of Phil, is a formal notice of your suspension as CEO, effective immediately, signed by your father and pre-approved by the company's legal team. Impossible, Phil whispered, but his eyes told a different story as he scanned the document. He recognized his father's signature, the legal timestamps, the corporate seals. The board will convene an emergency session on Monday, Kevin announced to both screens. At that time, we will review all evidence of misconduct and vote on the proposed acquisition by Wright Enterprises. Nicholas smiled slightly. Our offer ensures that the Powell name remains associated with the company, Kevin. As we discussed, you'll retain an honorary position on the board, and the Powell Foundation will continue its charitable work. The pieces were falling into place with devastating precision. Phil looked around the table, suddenly realizing that every person present, his father, his wife, his competitor, even his mistress, had played a role in his downfall. Why? He asked, turning to me. Why go to all this trouble? Why not? Just file for divorce? I met his gaze steadily. Because this isn't just about our marriage, Phil. This is about justice. For your father, who you betrayed and imprisoned in a care facility. For the employees whose careers you destroyed to make room for your girlfriend's friends. For the company's legacy that you were willing to tarnish for your own gratification. Kevin's voice came through the speaker again. Jean promised me on her wedding day that she would always look out for the best interests of both you and the company. Today, she's fulfilling that promise by stopping you from destroying everything we built. The weight of the moment settled over the private dining room. Outside, the city lights twinkled through the windows, oblivious to the corporate drama unfolding within. In less than 72 hours, those lights would illuminate newspaper headlines announcing the biggest corporate shakeup in the company's history. Phil Powell, the man who had orchestrated his father's removal and flaunted his infidelity at an anniversary dinner, was about to learn that true power lies not in titles or position, but in the quiet accumulation of truth and the patient execution of justice. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. The tension in the private dining room at La Maison Dorée had reached a fever pitch. Phil sat frozen in his chair, the weight of every revelation crushing his carefully constructed world. But this wasn't the end, merely the beginning of the avalanche I'd set in motion. Now, I said, checking my watch with deliberate casualness, we should discuss the press release scheduled to go out in exactly 17 minutes. I nodded to Nicholas, who produced a tablet displaying the draft announcement. Phil's head snapped up. Press release? Did you really think we'd wait until Monday's board meeting to make this public? I smiled, remembering all the times Phil had lectured me about the importance of controlling the narrative. The financial papers have already received their advance copies. They're just waiting for the embargo to lift. Scarlett, who had been silent since Kevin's appearance on the screen, suddenly found her voice. The media already knows? Of course they do, Nicholas interjected smoothly. Jean's background in corporate communications proved quite valuable in orchestrating this. The story breaks in all major financial outlets at midnight. Perfect timing for the Asian market's opening. Through the video conference, we could see the board members shifting uncomfortably. They knew what this meant. By morning, Powell Industries stock would be in free fall. You can't do this. Phil's voice had lost its authoritative edge, replaced by something approaching panic. The market impact is precisely why Wright Enterprises' offer is so generous, I completed for him. A premium of 40% over current market value, guaranteed positions for key personnel who weren't involved in your misconduct, and most importantly, preservation of the Powell legacy through the charitable foundation. Kevin's face on the second. Screen nodded approvingly. The offer protects the employees, the shareholders, and the family name. Everything you should have been protecting, son, instead of abusing your position. I gestured to the maitre d', who began distributing sealed envelopes to everyone present. These contain your personal copies of the evidence being provided to the SEC, I explained. The regulatory filing is already prepared. By the time Asian markets open, trading in Powell Industries stock will be suspended pending investigation. Scarlett's hands trembled as she opened her envelope. There must be some way to... To what? I asked quietly. To hide the systematic misuse of corporate funds, to conceal the irregular contracts, to explain away the suspicious promotions and hirings. I turned to face her directly. Or perhaps you'd like to explain to the SEC why the marketing director's brother suddenly received millions in procurement contracts despite having no relevant experience. The color drained from her face as she realized the full implications. This wasn't just about losing her position or her relationship with Phil. This was about potential criminal charges. Of course, Nicholas added smoothly, Wright Enterprises is prepared to be understanding about certain individuals' involvement, provided they cooperate fully with the investigation. The meaning was clear. Those who helped build the case against Phil might find soft landings in the restructured company. I watched as Scarlett's eyes darted between Phil and Nicholas, calculating her options. My phone buzzed. A message from the PR team. Financial Times requesting comment. Reuters and Bloomberg standing by. 12 minutes until the embargo lifts, I announced to the room. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss how each of you would like to be quoted in the press release. Phil surged to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. You're talking about destroying a century of what, Phil? Kevin's voice cut through his son's protests. A century of ethical business practices that you dismantled in 18 months? A century of family values that you threw away for a woman young enough to be your daughter? A century of corporate governance that you corrupted for your personal benefit? Through the video conference, Tobias Hartford cleared his throat. The board needs to consider its fiduciary duty to the shareholders. If what we've seen tonight is even partially true. It's all true, I assured him, sliding another document across the table. This is the preliminary report from the independent auditors. They've been working quietly for months, building a comprehensive picture of the irregularities under Phil's leadership. Nicholas reached for his wine glass, the picture of relaxed confidence. Wright Enterprises' offer includes provisions for handling any regulatory investigations. Our legal team has experience in managing similar situations. Discreetly. The implication hung in the air. There was a way out of this mess, but it required Phil's complete removal from the company. My phone buzzed again. Wall Street Journal confirms coverage for morning edition. Asia desk standing by. 8 minutes, I announced. The Asian markets open in exactly 1 hour. Once this news breaks, the stock will likely drop at least 30% before trading is suspended. I turned to the board members on screen. Unless, of course, we simultaneously announce the Wright Enterprises acquisition offer. Phil's hands clenched into fists on the table. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Not everything, I corrected him. Just everything that matters. The company's future. The employee's security, your father's legacy. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. All the things you should have been thinking about instead of abusing your position and flaunting your affair. The momentum was building, each revelation adding to the unstoppable force that would sweep away Phil's control of Powell Industries. In the next few minutes, the carefully constructed narrative would begin spreading through the financial world. And by morning, the corporate landscape would be forever changed. Sometimes the perfect revenge isn't just about the final blow. It's about creating a cascade of consequences that the target cannot possibly stop once they begin to fall. 5. Minutes until the embargo lifts, I announced, watching Phil's face as the reality of his situation finally sank in. The private dining room of La Maison Dorée, once the scene of so many of our anniversary celebrations, had become the staging ground for his complete corporate downfall. Nicholas Wright smoothly raised his hand, signaling the maitre d'. I believe this calls for a special bottle, something to mark the historic moment when two rival companies finally unite. His timing, as always, was impeccable, a subtle twist of the knife in an already devastating evening. Gian, Phil's voice had lost its corporate authority, taking on an almost pleading tone. You can't do this. 15 years of marriage? 15 years, I cut him off, during which you systematically dismantled everything your father built, used company resources as your personal bank account, and finally decided to humiliate your wife by bringing your mistress to our anniversary dinner. I turned to Scarlett. No offense, dear. You're just a symptom of a much larger disease. Through the video conference screen, Kevin Powell cleared his throat. The press release, Jean. It's time. I nodded, reaching for my phone. With one simple text, execute, I would set in motion the final phase of Phil's corporate execution. But first, there was one last card to play. Before I send this, I said, laying my phone on the table, I want to share something with everyone present. I withdrew a final document from my briefcase, different from the others, printed on personal stationery rather than corporate letterhead. What is that? Phil demanded, his eyes fixed on the paper. A letter, I replied calmly. Written by your father the day after our wedding. He gave it to me with instructions to open it if I ever felt the company was in danger. I began to read. My dear Jean, if you're reading this, then my fears about power's ability to corrupt have proven true. I've watched my son's ambition grow, and while ambition itself isn't harmful, the willingness to compromise ethics for success is a cancer that can destroy everything we've built. Phil's face had gone ashen. Through the video screen, Kevin nodded slowly, remembering the words he'd written 15 years ago. I'm entrusting you with this responsibility not just as my daughter-in-law, but as someone whose integrity and intelligence I've come to respect. If the time comes when the company's values are at risk, you have not just my permission, but my blessing to take whatever steps are necessary to protect the Powell legacy. Scarlett shifted uncomfortably in her seat as I continued reading. The true measure of leadership isn't in the power we wield, but in the principles we uphold. If Phil ever loses sight of this fundamental truth, the responsibility falls to you to remind him, by whatever means necessary. I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in my briefcase. Your father knew, Phil. He saw the potential. For this moment 15 years ago. Every step I've taken, joining the board, monitoring the finances, building relationships with key players, it was all in service of the promise I made to him that day. 2 minutes, Nicholas announced quietly, checking his watch. Phil's hand shot out suddenly, reaching for my phone, but I was faster. Years of anticipating his corporate maneuvers had taught me to stay one step ahead. It's too late, I said, holding the phone out of reach. The embargo lifts automatically at midnight. Even if I wanted to stop it, which I don't, the mechanism is already in motion. The financial world is about to learn exactly what's been happening at Powell Industries under your leadership. Through the video conference, the board members had grown restless. Tobias Hartford spoke up. The Wright Enterprises offer, it's our best option for containing this situation. It's our only option, I corrected. Unless you'd prefer to face the shareholders alone when they learn how their investments have been mismanaged. Scarlett stood abruptly. I need to make some calls. Sit down, Kevin's voice cracked like a whip through the speakers. No one leaves until this is finished. You helped create this situation. You'll help face the consequences. The maître d' appeared with champagne, an expensive vintage that in any other circumstance would have been cause for celebration. Nicholas began pouring glasses with deliberate ceremony. 30 seconds, I announced, watching the time tick down on my phone. Would anyone like to make any last-minute adjustments to their quotes in the press release? Phil's shoulders slumped in defeat. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the hollow realization that his world was about to implode in spectacular fashion. For what it's worth, I said softly, I did love you once. But you forgot the most important lesson your father tried to teach you. Integrity isn't something you can buy back once you've sold it. My phone buzzed as the clock struck midnight. The embargo had lifted. Within seconds, the notifications began flooding in. Financial Times running story now. Bloomberg alert live. Reuters pushing to global terminals. Asian markets reacting to news. The maitre d' discreetly turned on the private dining room's television, tuned to a financial news network. The breaking news banner was already scrolling. Powell Industries CEO suspended. Wright Enterprises announces acquisition offer. It's done, I said simply, raising my champagne glass. To new beginnings. Nicholas lifted his glass as well. To the future of Powell Wright Industries. Through the video conference, the board members watched in stunned silence as the financial channels began dissecting the announcement. Analysts were already speculating about the impact on market opening. Shareholders were being warned of pending investigations, and Phil's corporate empire was crumbling in real time on international television. Son? Kevin's voice was heavy with disappointment. You brought this on yourself. Every choice you made, every ethical line you crossed, led us to this moment. Phil stared at the television screen, watching as his professional reputation unraveled before his eyes. The timing had been perfect. Asian markets would react first, European markets would wake up to the news, and by the time Wall Street opened, the deal would be all but concluded. Sometimes the perfect revenge isn't just about personal satisfaction, it's about ensuring justice is served on every possible level. As I watched Phil's world collapse around him, I felt no joy, only a sense of completion. I had fulfilled my promise to his father, protected the company's legacy, and shown my husband exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman's capability for strategic thinking. The night was still young, but Phil Powell's reign as CEO had just ended. The aftermath unfolded exactly as planned. Within hours of the press release, Powell Industries stock had been suspended from trading on all major exchanges. Financial news networks were running wall-to-wall coverage of what they dubbed the Powell paradigm shift, a corporate takedown, so complete it would be studied in business schools for years to come. In La Maison Doré's private dining room, we watched the dominoes fall in perfect sequence. Phil sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the financial news ticker displaying the destruction of his corporate empire. Scarlett had retreated to a corner, frantically texting what I assumed were damage control messages to her network of improperly promoted employees. The Asian markets have fully priced in the news, Nicholas commented, studying his tablet. European pre-market trading suggests a similar pattern will follow. By the time New York opens, the Wright Enterprises offer will look like a lifeline, rather than a takeover. I checked my own phone, watching the cascade of consequences spread through the business world. Board members from other companies were already resigning from joint ventures with Powell Industries. Corporate partners were issuing statements distancing themselves from Phil's. The SEC has formally acknowledged receipt of our documentation, I announced to the room. They're launching a priority investigation into the financial irregularities. I turned to Scarlett. They're particularly interested in the procurement contracts awarded to your family members. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she set down her phone. I need to speak with my lawyer. That would be wise. Kevin's voice came through the video conference. Though you might want to consider the offer of immunity in exchange for cooperation. Jean and Nicholas have prepared quite a comprehensive package for those willing to assist the investigation. Phil's head snapped up at this. You're offering deals to her? To anyone who helps ensure a smooth transition, Nicholas confirmed. Smoothly. Wright Enterprises believes in rehabilitative corporate culture. Those who acknowledge their mistakes and help correct them can find a path forward. Through the video screen, Tobias Hartford cleared his throat. The board has finished reviewing the preliminary evidence. We're prepared to vote on the temporary leadership structure until the Wright acquisition is finalized. I nodded, withdrawing yet another document from my briefcase. The transition team has already been selected, a mixture of Wright Enterprises executives and Powell Industries veterans who weren't involved in Phil's creative management style. You've really thought of everything, Phil muttered, more to himself than to the room. No, I corrected him. I simply thought of all the things you should have been thinking about instead of abusing your position and betraying your father's trust. My phone buzzed with another update. Major institutional investors signaling support for Wright acquisition. Market confidence stabilizing. The Powell Family Foundation, Phil started, but Kevin cut him off. Will continue its charitable work under new leadership, his father assured him. That legacy, at least, we've managed to preserve. No thanks. To you. The maitre d' appeared with fresh coffee. This evening was far from over. The financial world was waking up to the news, and each time zone would bring fresh reactions, new consequences, additional fallout. Perhaps, Nicholas suggested diplomatically, this would be a good time to discuss the personal aspects of this transition. Compensation packages, separation agreements, non-disclosure terms. Phil laughed bitterly. You're offering me a severance package? After orchestrating my complete destruction? No, I replied calmly. We're offering you a choice. The same choice you never gave your father, your employees, or your wife. You can fight this, trigger a very public, very detailed investigation into every aspect of your misconduct. Or you can accept the generous terms we've prepared and exit gracefully. Scarlett stood suddenly. I'd like to discuss those cooperation terms now. I smiled, remembering how quickly corporate loyalty could evaporate when self-interest was at stake. Nicholas's legal team will be in touch first thing in the morning. I suggest you retain independent counsel before making any formal statements. Through the video conference, we could see more notifications flooding the board members' phones. The story was spreading, growing, evolving with each passing minute. The Asian markets close in 1 hour, Nicholas noted. European trading floors are preparing for opening. The next few hours will cement the narrative that drives market reaction. I checked my watch, the same elegant timepiece Phil had given me for our 10th anniversary. The Powell Wright transition team holds its first press conference at 9 a.m. Eastern. We should finalize any personal negotiations before then. Phil stared at me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in our marriage. You've been planning this for months. Years, I corrected him. Ever since I found the first irregularities in the company finances. Every late night you spent with Scarlett, I spent building the case that would protect your father's legacy from your corruption. Kevin's face on the screen showed a mixture of sadness and pride. The company's survival was always more important than any individual's ambitions, son. That's what I tried to teach you. That's what Jean understood. The weight of consequences settled over the private dining room. Outside, the city lights twinkled unchanged, but inside, decades of corporate history were being rewritten. Phil Powell's reign as CEO had ended not with a bang, but with a meticulously orchestrated symphony of legal, financial, and personal revelations. Sometimes the perfect revenge isn't just about the initial strike. It's about ensuring that every consequence, every ramification, every aftershock serves the cause of justice. As I watched Phil's world continue to unravel, I felt no triumph, only a sense of completion. The promise I'd made to his father 15 years ago had been fulfilled, and the Powell legacy would survive, even if Phil's career wouldn't. The night was far from over, but the corporate execution had been completed with surgical precision. All that remained was to manage the aftermath and ensure that every consequence served its intended purpose. As dawn broke over the city, I sat alone in my home office, watching the European markets react to the news. The television silently displayed financial networks where analysts dissected every aspect of the Powell-Wright merger, as they dubbed it, though corporate coup might have been more accurate. My phone had finally stopped its constant buzzing of notifications. The initial shockwaves had rippled through every time zone, and now the business world was settling into a new reality. Powell Industries, a century-old family business, had transformed overnight. I opened my laptop to review the morning's headlines. Powell Industries CEO ousted in spectacular corporate takedown. Wright Enterprises acquires rival in surprise move. Corporate scandal leads to historic merger. Powell Air suspended amid financial misconduct allegations. The last email I'd received was from Nicholas. Transition team in place. Board approval secured. Legal proceedings initiating as planned.